Hey everyone, today we're going to dive into something pretty fascinating, a concept that has captivated readers and scholars for literally centuries. It's called Old Testament Typology. Now what it really is this approach to reading that suggests the whole biblical story is woven together with these incredible hidden threads and echoes. So yeah, let's get into it.
All right, so let's just start with the big question that always comes up. Is there some kind of secret code hidden in the Bible? It sounds like something out of a thriller movie, doesn't it? But the answer isn't really about cryptic messages. It's actually something way more sophisticated, a very deliberate literary technique that's designed to connect the entire story from beginning to end.
So, that brings us to our first section. What is Bible typology, really? We're about to break down this amazing idea of literary foreshadowing.
Okay, so at its very core, typology is a literary device. It's this idea that specific people, events, or even institutions in the Old Testament are basically designed to prefigure or anticipate their counterparts in the New Testament. You can kind of think of it as a series of patterns and echoes that are just woven all throughout the texts.
Probably the easiest way to wrap your head around this is to think of it as literary foreshadowing, but on this absolutely epic scale. We're talking across hundreds, even thousands of years. An author might hint at something in chapter 1 that pays off in chapter 10, right? Well, typology suggests the Bible does that across 2 entire testaments. It's pretty wild.
Now this isn't just some random game of finding similarities. Nope. Scholars have actually identified really specific methods for this kind of interpretation. So let's explore the 3 main tools that are in the typological toolkit.
So here are the 3 big ones. First up, you've got the antitype. This points to a really direct one-to-one connection. An Old Testament type has a corresponding New Testament antitype. Simple as that. Next is allegory, which is more symbolic. It's about looking beneath the surface of the literal story to find a deeper, more metaphorical link. And finally, there's prefiguration. This is your classic foreshadowing, where an event or a person in the Old Testament is basically setting the stage for what's seen as its ultimate fulfillment in the New.
Okay, so theory is one thing, but seeing typology in action, that's where it really comes alive. Let's look at some actual examples of how these narrative dots could connected across the Bible.
So here's a great example of a direct antitype. In the Old Testament, you have Abraham. He's called by God to be the father of a new nation. Then, the New Testament mirrors this with Jesus, who is presented as a savior for the entire world. So the role is really similar, this foundational figure, but the scope, it's just massively expanded.
Now, let's look at an allegorical example. You've got Moses, right? He leads his people out of physical slavery in Egypt and delivers God's law. A typological reading sees this as a really powerful metaphor for Christ, who leads people from spiritual bondage and offers forgiveness instead of law. It's a really deep, symbolic parallel.
And for our last example, let's talk prefiguration. So, David is anointed king over the physical kingdom of Israel. This whole event is interpreted as foreshadowing Jesus, the King of Kings, whose kingdom is spiritual, not earthly. David's reign is almost seen as the preview for the main event.
Okay, so we've seen what typology is and how it works, but the real question is, so what? Why does this even matter? What's the real significance of looking at it this way? Well, it all comes down to the idea of a single, unified story.
Typology is really significant for 3 main reasons. First, it connects the Old and New Testaments, showing them not as separate books, but as 2 acts in the same grand play. Second, from a theological point of view, it suggests a divine plan, with the Old Testament intentionally paving the way for the New. And third, it implies the story has a universal message, one that extends way beyond its original audience, to all people, everywhere.
But of course, like any method of interpretation, typology has its critics. It's not without its challenges. So to get the full picture, it's really important we also consider the limitations that scholars have pointed out over the years.
So there are a few key counter-arguments. Some scholars argue that if you focus too much on the foreshadowing, you risk diminishing the original historical importance of the Old Testament stories themselves, what they meant to the people at the time. Others point out that spotting these connections can be really tough, and it requires a lot of background knowledge. And finally, and this is a big one, especially with allegory, the interpretations can become highly subjective. What one person sees as a clear symbol, another person might just miss entirely.
So, in the end, it's probably best to think of typology not as some kind of secret code, but as a powerful interpretive lens. It's a way of reading that has shaped how we understand the Bible for centuries. It reveals these incredibly deep narrative connections, but it also comes with some very valid limitations that are absolutely worth thinking about.
And that leaves us with one last thought to chew on, one that actually goes way beyond just the Bible. What does it change for us as readers, for our whole understanding of history and literature, if we start to look for these kinds of connections in all ancient texts, seeing them not as just isolated documents, but as parts of a single, interconnected human story?